Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into quite a topic. It sits right at the intersection of the justice system, big business, and, maybe surprisingly, the world of music.
Yeah, it's a complex mix. For this deep dive, we've gathered quite a range of sources. We've got excerpts from Wikipedia on one of the big private prison companies.
Right.
Articles from places like Rap Rehab and ATTN, looking into the whole prison-for-profit industry.
And crucially, we've also pulled from the NPR podcast Louder Than a Riot, which did its own deep dive, plus an academic article from Project MUS. These really dig into a specific theory, an alleged link between the music industry and private prisons.
Exactly. So our mission today is to try and unpack all of this. We want to understand the complicated history of private prisons.
How they started, how they grew.
How the money actually flows, what makes them profitable.
Yeah.
Look at the controversies surrounding them, because there are quite a few. And then, investigate this persistent theory. It's almost like an urban legend for some people about how this whole industry might connect with the music you listen to, especially hip-hop.
We're going to try and connect some dots that the sources lay out, and some of them might be pretty surprising.
Definitely.
So let's start at the beginning, because the idea of private prisons in the U.S., it's not actually brand new, is it? Our sources trace roots way back.
No, not at all. You can trace it back to systems like convict leasing, particularly the Reconstruction South, right after the Civil War.
Okay, convict leasing, how did that work?
Well, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but, and this is crucial, it had that exception, except as a punishment for crime.
Ah, the loophole.
Exactly.
Oh.
The sources explain this loophole allowed states to create all sorts of racially targeted laws, vagrancy laws, stuff like that, specifically designed to incarcerate black people at much higher rates.
Okay.
And then these newly incarcerated people were leased out, essentially forced labor, to work on plantations, build railroads, work in mines.
And the conditions, I imagine, were not good.
Often horrific.
Mm.
Some sources argue maybe even worse than slavery in some ways, because the people leasing the convicts didn't have the same long-term investment incentive,
Right, just use them up.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly profitable for the states and for the former slave owners or businesses who leased the labor.
Wow. Okay, so that's the historical route. Fast forward quite a bit.
Yeah, way forward to the modern era, the 1980s. That's when you see the rise of companies like the Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA.
And now called Core Civic, right?
That's the one. They started with a jail facility in Hamilton County, Tennessee, back in 1984.
And they had big plans from the start, didn't they? The sources mentioned this really bold move in 1985.
Oh, yeah. CCA actually offered to take over Tennessee's entire state prison system for $200 million.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. Now, that specific bid failed, but it just shows you the level of ambition right out of the gate.
Definitely. And despite that one failing, the industry took off.
It really did. Between 1984 and 1990, just those 6 years, 66 private prisons opened up across the U.S.
Wow, that's fast growth.
It is. And by 2019, the sources say privately owned facilities housed about 8.1% of the total U.S. prison population.
8%. Is that mostly state or federal?
It's interesting, actually. The percentage was much higher at the federal level, around 15.7%, compared to about 7.1% at the state level.
Why the difference, do you think?
Well, the sources suggest it relates partly to the types of offenses. Federal prisons handle more immigration detention and certain drug offenses, which ties into things we'll discuss later about population streams.
Gotcha. And are they just in the U.S. or international, too?
They've looked internationally. CCA apparently met with French officials way back in the 80s, so nothing came of it. But GEO Group, another big player, does run facilities in the UK, Australia, and South Africa.
Interesting. How does that compare to somewhere like Canada?
It's a contrast. The sources mention Canada, where private facilities have mostly been taken back under government control. There was even one study comparing a private Canadian facility to a similar public one, and it found the publicly run prison actually had better outcomes for the inmates, better rehabilitation, things like that.
Okay. So if we understand the history, this link to forced labor and the modern growth, how do they actually make money now? What's the business model?
Well, at its heart, like a lot of businesses that rely on physical space, think hotels, maybe it's about occupancy, keeping beds filled.
Right. Makes sense.
A report from the 90s that the sources cite basically said low occupancy is a drag on profits. So the core mechanic is maximizing the number of people incarcerated in their facilities.
And this isn't just like hoping for more inmates. There are mechanisms to ensure that.
This is where it gets really controversial. The sources point to things like occupancy guarantees. Remember CCA? In 2012, they sent a letter to 48 states offering to buy their public prisons.
Buy them outright.
Yes. But here's the kicker. In exchange, the states would have to sign a 20-year contract guaranteeing that those prisons would stay at least 90% full.
90%. What happens if crime drops or sentencing changes and they don't meet that quota?
That's the controversial part. If the state doesn't send enough people to meet that 90% threshold, the state has to pay the private company for the empty beds.
You're kidding. Pay for people not being in prison.
Exactly. The sources give an example from Arizona where the state apparently had to pay one company something like $3 million because they didn't meet the quota. They paid for unused beds.
Wow. That creates a really powerful incentive, doesn't it? Not necessarily for public safety, but just to keep beds full.
It absolutely highlights the incentive structure. And it's not hidden. In their required filings with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, these companies list things that could hurt their business.
Like what?
Things like relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency and sentencing practices, or even the decriminalization of certain activities. These are listed as potential risks to their revenue because they reduce the demand for prison beds.
So policies that might reduce incarceration are seen as bad for business.
From their perspective, yes. And their lobbying, particularly at the federal level, often focuses on areas like immigrant detention, which provides a steady stream of detainees.
Okay, but what about the main argument you always hear that they save taxpayer money? Is there truth to that?
That's the big selling point, always has been. And on the surface, some numbers seem to back it up. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, the BOP, did report lower average daily costs per inmate in private facilities compared to public ones.
What were the numbers?
The source mentioned around $22,488 per year in private versus $24,426 in public. So about $2,000 cheaper per person per year on average.
But I sense a but coming.
There's definitely a but. The sources strongly push back on this data, arguing it's incomplete. The BOP apparently doesn't get detailed spending breakdowns from the private companies.
So they can't compare apples to apples, like how much is spent on food or healthcare or staffing.
Exactly. Critics argue that any savings often come directly from cutting those very things. Paying staff less, having fewer staff on duty, reducing training requirements.
Which could impact safety and conditions.
Precisely. And another huge factor critics raise is cherry picking.
Cherry picking inmates.
Yeah. Private prisons often have contracts that allow them to refuse inmates who are expected to be more expensive. People with serious chronic health conditions like HIV or hepatitis C or significant mental health needs.
So they take the cheaper, healthier inmates, which makes their average cost look lower.
That's the argument. It makes a direct cost comparison really misleading because they aren't managing the same complexity population as public prisons. Some research cited actually concludes private prisons might cost more in the long run, or that the promised savings just have simply not materialized.
And if they're cutting costs on staffing and training, does that lead to more problems inside, more danger?
That's a major criticism found in the sources. They argue these cost-cutting measures can make facilities more dangerous for both staff and inmates. Louisiana is highlighted as having the highest incarceration rate in the U.S., and a majority of its inmates are housed in for-profit facilities.
Okay, so the cost savings are questionable, and there are potential downsides. This seems like a good point to pivot to the controversies you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and the sources detail quite a long list. Understaffing is a really common theme.
We talked about the cost cutting.
Right, and it leads to real issues. The ACLU sued CCA back in 2010 over the Idaho Correctional Center, ICC. They alleged severe understaffing was directly leading to high levels of violence.
Violence between inmates.
Yes, and generally unsafe conditions. This lawsuit even triggered an FBI investigation into whether federal laws were broken, including accusations that CCA was falsifying its staffing records to make it look like they were meeting contract requirements.
Did they find anything?
Well, CCA later admitted they had falsified staffing logs at ICC, and an audit found the state had been overbilled for more than 26,000 staff hours that were never actually worked.
26,000 hours? That's significant.
It is. And Idaho seemed like a particular trouble spot. There were accusations guards weren't protecting inmates. A federal judge actually held CCA in contempt for violating a previous settlement about staffing level.
Contempt of court, wow.
Yeah. And even more disturbingly, a lawsuit alleged that at one point, prison officials had kind of ceded partial control of the prison to gang leaders groups, named like the Aryan Knights and severely violent criminals, basically letting them help manage things because staffing was so low.
That sounds completely out of control.
Eventually, Idaho took back control of that facility in 2014. But it wasn't just Idaho.
What other kinds of issues pop up?
Well, there's the revolving door criticism.
Meaning?
People moving between government agencies that oversee prisons, like the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and executive jobs at the private prison companies. Sometimes these hires happen soon after the person resigns from government, occasionally following some kind of controversy or scandal at their old agency.
Suggests a cozy relationship, maybe too cozy.
That's the concern, yeah. Then there are specific incidents at various facilities mentioned in the sources. Riots reported in Kentucky and Mississippi. An Ohio facility saw high levels of violence and contraband, like drugs, after CCA took over management.
What else?
Really disturbing reports of sexual abuse by staff members came out of facilities in Kentucky and Oklahoma. Health issues, like a scabies outbreak in a Tennessee facility. And tragically, a correctional officer was killed at an Oklahoma facility run by a private company.
Just a pattern of serious problems.
It seems that way from the sources. One really egregious incident they detail happened at the Leavenworth Detention Center.
Leavenworth, the famous name.
Right, but this was a CoreCivic-run facility. They were found to be illegally recording audio of attorney-client phone calls.
That's definitely illegal. Those are privileged conversations.
Hugely privileged. A federal judge called it a horrendous situation. Prosecutors got hold of these recordings while investigating something else, like contraband, and dozens of these private calls were illegally shared among lawyers.
What was the consequence?
In one case, a defendant was released almost 3 years early because recordings of her conversations with her lawyer were improperly shared with the prosecution team. CoreCivic tried to argue that silent video recording was standard for security, but recording the audio of lawyer calls is a massive breach.
Wow. Any issues with the employees themselves beyond just staffing levels?
The sources mention a couple of things. In 2020, a captain at a CoreCivic facility in Nevada was apparently identified as having ties to a neo-Nazi website called Iron March. He was later fired.
Oh, great.
And a more recent story describes a CoreCivic employee who was reportedly a disgraced former cop fired for drunk driving, allegedly playing a key role in mischaracterizing a Venezuelan immigrant, a makeup artist, as a gang member, which ultimately led to his deportation in 2025.
Just troubling individual incidents stacked on top of systemic issues.
And it goes beyond the facility level, too. There have been higher-level corruption scandals. A bribery scheme in Mississippi where millions were allegedly paid to state officials and legislators connected to private prison contracts.
Right.
And probably the most infamous one, the Kids for Cash scandal in Pennsylvania.
I remember hearing about that. That was judges, right?
Yeah, 2 judges took millions in kickbacks from a company that ran private juvenile detention centers. In return, they sent thousands of kids to these facilities, often for really minor offenses, trespassing, petty theft, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Destroyed lives.
Unbelievable. It feels like a recurring theme through all these controversies is secrecy, lack of oversight.
That's definitely a point the sources emphasize. Compared to publicly run facilities, which are subject to things like freedom of information requests, private prisons are often much less transparent. One source quotes the ACLU saying something like, "It's already hard to know what's happening inside public prisons. It gets 10 times harder with a private facility."
Okay, so we have this industry with controversial roots, questionable business practices, driving incentives, and a history plagued by serious problems and lack of transparency.
Right. But to really understand why this industry grew so much and who ends up filling those beds, especially when we start thinking about the alleged hip-hop connection, we need to zoom out a bit.
To the broader context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to talk about mass incarceration in the U.S. and specifically the war on drugs.
Which really ramped up around the same time these private prisons started booming in the 80s.
Precisely. The sources link the intensification of the war on drugs under the Reagan administration. You remember the Just Say No campaign directly to a massive explosion in the U.S. prison population.
Not necessarily for violent crime, right?
Often not. A huge portion of that increase came from nonviolent drug offenses, sometimes simple possession of small amounts. The U.S. ended up with some of the longest sentences for first-time drug offenses among developed countries.
And this war wasn't waged equally, was it?
Not according to the sources, no. They state pretty clearly that it was disproportionately targeted at low-income communities of color. You saw huge sentencing disparities. The infamous 100-to-1 ratio for crack versus powder cocaine is the classic example.
Which punished black communities much more harshly for essentially the same drug.
Right. That ratio has been reduced since then, but disparity still exists. And generally, people of color receive longer sentences, face mandatory minimums more often, even when convicted of the exact same crimes as white individuals.
This is the backdrop against which certain narratives emerged, isn't it? Like the super predator idea.
That term pops up in the 90s, coined by a professor, but then heavily used by politicians. The sources mentioned then. Senator Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton specifically, though both later expressed regret over using it.
What was the impact of that term?
It was used to justify really tough lock-'em-up policies, most notably the 1994 crime bill. The sources described super predator as basically becoming America's code word for the young, black, and dangerous. It fueled fear and punitive measures.
And the sources also mentioned government agencies possibly playing a role in shaping public perception.
Yeah, they talk about the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, allegedly using mass media for what's described as propaganda. Terms like crack whores and crack babies started appearing.
Which sound incredibly loaded.
Described in the sources as racial dog whistles, basically. Language designed to dehumanize and justify harsher policies against specific communities.
Okay, so you have this intense focus on drug crime, racial disparities in enforcement and sentencing, and dehumanizing language. How did people living in those communities experience this?
One of the sources includes powerful quotes from Killer Mike, the rapper and activist, talking about growing up in Atlanta during this time. He describes seeing policing change dramatically. He contrasts the older cops, who were maybe down-homey enough, with the newer units like the Red Dogs, which he said looked like paramilitary forces. Their game was to hunt, he said. He felt directly targeted.
Yes, absolutely, because we were, I think was his quote.
That's it. And his point, which is central to understanding the hip-hop side of this, is that the music wasn't the cause of this environment. It was a reaction to it.
Like Ice-T's 6 in the Morning, he mentions.
Right. He sees that kind of early gangster rap as artists just describing their reality, honestly, poetically. It was their version of the blues, documenting the struggle against this backdrop of the drug war and aggressive policing.
So the argument is that gangster rap emerged from the conditions created by the war on drugs and mass incarceration, not the other way around.
That's the perspective presented. It reflected the environment. And, maybe cynically, the sources suggest that because it sometimes mirrored existing stereotypes, it became an easy sell to white suburban audiences, leading to huge record sales.
Okay, so now we have the context. Mass incarceration, racial disparities, the war on drugs, and a music genre born from that reality. This is where the theory about a direct link to private prisons comes in, right?
Exactly. This is where we get into that significant theory mentioned in the sources.
Yeah.
The idea that the music industry, specifically hip-hop, was, or maybe still is, being intentionally manipulated to help keep private prisons full.
And the centerpiece of this theory is often that anonymous conspiracy letter that circulated.
Yes, the NPR source discusses it in detail. This letter, which surfaced years ago, alleged there was this secret meeting back in 1991.
What supposedly happened at this meeting?
The letter claimed music industry executives were gathered and told, essentially, that their parent companies had invested heavily in the private prison industry.
Okay.
And therefore, their job, going forward, was to push and market music that promoted criminal lifestyles, violence, drug use, specifically targeting rap music, to ensure a steady supply of people, primarily young black men, to fill those prisons and keep the investments profitable.
That's a pretty explosive claim. A secret meeting to weaponize hip-hop for prison profits.
Hugely explosive. Now, whether that letter is describing a real event or is itself a fabrication, the sources note it became incredibly influential online. It spread like wildfire.
Like a Willie Lynch letter for hip-hop, one source called it.
Exactly. Referencing that infamous, though likely fake, historical document about controlling slaves, this letter tapped into pre-existing anxieties and suspicions within the black community about the changing nature of hip-hop, a shift some saw from more conscious pro-black themes in the 80s towards more nihilistic pro-crack or criminal narratives in the 90s.
So the letter resonated because it seemed to explain that shift, even if it wasn't true.
Precisely. It provided a seemingly neat, albeit conspiratorial, explanation. So the debate presented in the sources becomes, is this a literal factual account of a conspiracy? Or is it more like propaganda itself, something that taps into legitimate fears and paranoia born from the very real destructive impact of the criminal justice system on Black people in America?
Okay, let's dig into the evidence the sources present that might support or at least fuel this kind of theory. Whether the letter is real or not, what connections do they point to?
One of the big ones is media ownership overlap.
Right. Who owns what?
The Rap Rehab article highlights a Bloomberg analysis. It pointed out that huge investment firms, specifically naming Vanguard and BlackRock, hold major stakes in both giant media companies like Time Warner, Viacom, the companies that own record labels and TV channels,
Okay.
and the biggest private prison companies, CoreCivic and GEO Group.
So the same big money funds are invested in both the companies creating the music media and the companies profiting from incarceration.
That's the connection drawn. Now, there's nuance, right? A commenter mentioned in the sources clarifies this is often asset management. These firms manage trillions for lots of investors whose funds happen to hold shares in all these different companies. They don't necessarily own them in the way a founder does.
That's not like one CEO is controlling both directly.
Probably not. But another perspective offered is that it still means the ultimate beneficiaries, the investors whose money is in those funds, are profiting from both industries simultaneously. The Rap Rehab source basically concludes that the people who own the media, or at least have significant financial interest in it, are the same people with interest in private prisons.
Implying a potential conflict of interest, or at least an alignment of financial incentives. Using media content to drive behavior that benefits the prison investments could be, as they put it, very lucrative.
That's the implication drawn. Yeah. It suggests why they might not intervene even if they saw harmful trends.
Okay, ownership overlap is one piece. What about direct influence? Did labels actually push artists towards more negative or criminal content?
Here, the sources offer anecdotal evidence. We hear from the rapper Too Short. He talked about his time at Jive Records.
What did he say?
He recalled his label boss basically telling him he should make a dirty fucking album.
Oh,
Why? Because artists on Death Row Records, like Snoop Dogg, were selling more records by being raunchy and talking about street life more explicitly.
So direct pressure from the label based on what was selling.
Exactly. The NPR source interprets this as evidence that, yeah, the industry did sometimes push artists towards content that fit certain, often negative stereotypes.
But do they frame it as part of the grand prison conspiracy?
Not necessarily. They frame it more as market forces, labels chasing hits, individual executives making decisions based on what was selling well at the time, rather than a coordinated plot specifically designed to fill prisons. It's contrasted with people like Jimmy Iovine from Interscope, who defended promoting gangster rap by saying they were just reflecting reality, giving artists a platform.
It's a complex picture. What's interesting is Too Short's view now, though.
Yeah, the irony isn't lost. He's now critical of some modern trap music, calling it rock yourself to sleep brainwashing. He says it promotes the trap lifestyle, which, in his view, ultimately leads to a fucking prison cell or a coffin.
So the guy who was pushed to be raunchier is now critiquing the evolution of that trend, a real generational perspective shift.
Absolutely. It adds another layer to the debate about intent versus impact.
Okay, so ownership overlap, some evidence of label pressure. What about the idea of artists being targeted by law enforcement? Does that fit in?
The sources definitely discuss this. They bring up figures like Derek Parker, who called himself the hip-hop cop, and they talk about a secret NYPD dossier created on the turn of the millennium.
A dossier on rappers.
Yeah, apparently monitoring rappers, their entourages, their activities. It even involved putting pressure on venues sometimes, trying to get them to cancel hip-hop shows.
Why? What was the justification?
Parker claimed it was partly for the artist's own protection, given the violence in the industry at times. But the NPR hosts frame it as potentially problematic, maybe even violating First Amendment rights, based on assumptions made about the music, the artists, and their audiences. They also note police tracking rap beefs in the media might have been partly about boosting their own profiles.
And wasn't there something about the Source magazine being contacted by feds?
Yeah, Kim Osorio, who was editor-in-chief, talked about federal agents contacting her after they published issues focusing on hip-hop behind bars. She had a legal background and basically told them she wouldn't cooperate without probable cause.
How did she interpret those inquiries?
She saw it as clear evidence of the system targeting Black and brown people involved in hip-hop culture, trying to link the music directly to criminal activity.
Okay, so you have all these pieces. The history, the profit motive, the ownership links, the label pressure anecdotes, the police targeting. Does it add up to that specific 1991 meeting conspiracy?
This is where perspectives really diverge in the sources. Nelson George, a prominent writer, filmmaker, very knowledgeable about hip-hop history, actually wrote a novel with a similar plot.
So he believes it.
Not the literal letter, no.
Yeah.
He's quoted saying he thinks the specific conspiracy letter is ridiculous. He calls it a fanciful vision.
Why ridiculous?
He argues it overestimates how organized and coordinated the music industry actually is, or ever was. He doesn't think things work that way, with secret cabals dictating content like that. He cautions against assuming every bad thing in America is run by some secret group, even while fully acknowledging real, documented government abuses like the Tuskegee experiment or COINTELPRO.
So he sees the systemic issues, but doubts the highly specific, coordinated plot described in the letter.
Exactly. But then you have Killer Mike's perspective again, which is more nuanced and brings it back to the system itself.
What's his take on the conspiracy idea?
He says he listens to conspiracies, doesn't automatically believe or disbelieve, just hears them out, but he finds many of them believable. Because, as he puts it, all this business is attached. He points to how massive conglomerates today own everything from media companies to food companies to, yes, potentially having investments related to the prison system. It's all interconnected financially.
He connects it back to those systemic issues we talked about earlier.
Directly. He links it to things we know are real. The correlation between failing to read by 3rd grade and increased likelihood of ending up in prison. The massive disparities in healthcare and education funding between wealthy white communities and poor communities of color.
And he had that provocative point about the Constitution.
Yeah, asking why there's more public outrage about threats to the Second Amendment than about the 13th Amendment's exception clause. He emphasizes that, under the Constitution, slavery is still legal as punishment for a crime.
Which creates a potential demand.
A potential need to fill the void of slaves, as he puts it, if there's a profit to be made from their incarceration. For him, the existence of a profit motive for jailing poor people makes almost any conspiracy about how that system is fed seem plausible.
So for him, it's less about proving the specific 1991 meeting happened and more about the fact that the underlying incentives make such a thing conceivable. The proof's in the pudding, he says.
Exactly. The structure itself is the problem. Making these connections, real or theorized, deeply troubling.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels like we've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We've journeyed through the pretty tangled history of private prisons, from those roots in convict leasing right up to the modern corporate era.
We looked at their business model, the importance of occupancy, those controversial guarantee clauses, and the long list of criticisms and scandals tied to the profit motive.
And we placed it all in the context of mass incarceration, fueled by policies like the war on drugs, which we know had a devastating and disproportionate impact on communities of color.
And then we dove into that specific, persistent theory about the music industry, particularly hip-hop, being entangled with the private prison industry.
Yeah, we examined the evidence presented in the sources, the overlaps in corporate ownership, those anecdotes about label pressure, the targeting of artists by law enforcement.
And we heard different perspectives on whether it adds up to a literal conspiracy like that secret meeting letter described, or if it points to something more systemic, more about aligned incentives and cultural impact.
Right. And maybe the key takeaway is that whether or not that one specific meeting ever happened, the sources undeniably reveal these complex, troubling intersections. You've got powerful business interests, deep-seated systemic inequalities with historical roots, and a cultural landscape that both reflects and is influenced by music like hip-hop. They're all tangled together.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? If, as Killer Mike and others point out, slavery is technically still legal in the U.S. as punishment for crime via the 13th Amendment, and if major corporations can build a business model where profit is directly linked to keeping prison beds full, what does that fundamental incentive structure imply? Not just about those companies, but about potential biases within the justice system itself.
It's a heavy question. What do we do with this knowledge? As people who listen to music, consume media, participate in society, what's our responsibility once we're aware of these connections, these potential incentives?
Yeah. Lots to chew on there. This deep dive really just scratches the surface of that complex, often dark relationship between rhyme and punishment in America.